Now here is our famous or perhaps infamous subway map, which shows the vendors that we cover in the different marketplaces. So you notice that we have the purple line, for example, which is marketing automation, the pink line for digital asset management. Today, we're going to focus on the dark blue line, which is customer data platform. It's the most recent addition to our research portfolio, and it's one that's really catching a lot of steam, and we're really excited about it. And so Tony's going to walk you through the way to select a customer data platform that's going to be the right fit for your needs. So Tony, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'm really excited about this topic because it's such a fast-moving marketplace. It can be difficult to track, and I think that it's one of those marketplaces in particular that really brings into relief just the real problem with these static quadrants. And this is why I founded the company 18 years ago, was really because of quadrants like this. I was working at a systems integration firm. We were trying to implement some tools that were in the top right, so-called winners quadrant, and they weren't working out very well. And then I discovered how this was actually done, and I realized there had to be a better way to tell the real story about how these tools actually work in live environments. So founded Real Story Group, originally CMS Watch 18 years ago, and we've been evaluating vendors ever since. And as Scott said, most recently, customer data platforms, and this was really on by demand of our existing subscribers, many of whom have been looking at this or really kind of building these over the years. And it's been an interesting dive for us. First, let's back up though and just describe what a CDP does. Is it, aggregates and accumulates and unifies your customer data, and that's however you want to define it. Certainly, first-party data is very important, and is what distinguishes a CDP from a DMP, which typically just has third-party data. But you can also aggregate second and third-party data. And then, of course, what you really want to do with this is then activate that data across different channels, both inbound and outbound, and potentially do some light analytics as well. So it's a clearly I think a long-standing need in the marketplace. The challenge that we've had historically is that you didn't always have a single place to do this. So here's just an example of an individual record and all the information about this person. So this is, of course, what every marketer wants, and the problem is, where do you build this? How do you build this? Historically, when we look across these major channels and all the production delivery services, and then in here, this colored area, content engagement management, that's where you want to really activate all this data. And historically, what enterprise customers would do is build a kind of custom data backbone. In other words, they build it themselves off some sort of a maybe quasi data warehouse environment. And we know from seeing many of these that a number of you have been actually fairly successful doing this. The problem is that these sorts of platforms usually are not very marketer friendly and can be inflexible and somewhat techie in orientation. So it was really calling out for vendors to productize this, turning it from a kind of a custom customer data backbone here down in the bottom in magenta, and turn it into actual platforms that you can deploy in the cloud in a much more custom way. So many vendors have answered that call. You've got suite vendors over on the left who sort of have a story here. Talk about that a little bit more later, and then a whole slew of pure play platforms. And we're covering more each quarter as they emerge around the world. And so you have a lot of choices. You have a growing set of choices. And so that's exciting because competition is always good. It can also be a little bit dizzying. And so that's why we're on this call here together today. Now, I want to remind you that you can ask questions at any time in the GoToWebinar control panel. And so we'll definitely have time to address those at the end. Also wanted to remind you that everyone on this webinar will get a copy of the deck, and those of you who are Real Story Group subscribers, you'll get access to a live recording you can share with your colleagues as well. Okay, so here's just another example. A CDP allows you to basically get data in and push it out. There's a lot more to it than that. You can obviously clean and normalize and do all sorts of interesting things with the data, definitely stitch together different records and devices to a single individual, and then output that to some platform that's then going to leverage that data, right? So it's a kind of an input-output thing, but that's just sort of what's actually happening with the data itself. The larger story here is really around scope. So if we take that initial diagram and we say, look, maybe we can look at this in the context of more enterprise foundation services. One of those, as you see on the lower left here, would be a customer data platform. We have definitive prospecting customer data and segments that then you feed across all these different channels. What's notable about this architecture is that CRM up there in the kind of salmon color on the left, that no longer becomes a data store. It's really more of a service layer for you. So that's where you're doing customer care and Salesforce automation, but you're keeping your key customer data kind of separate and distinct as an enterprise foundation service. Now, having said that, you need to be careful because CDP vendors, not surprisingly, also can supply other services like campaign and journey orchestration, potentially analytics. Some will even do your email service provider work for you. And so you've got to ask yourself, be really clear about scope. We tend to be a little bit more purist about this, just the idea that the whole reason why you're getting a CDP is to have this kind of enterprise flexibility and not bind different services together that don't belong together. But this will be a choice for you to make as far. So that's the first question you want to ask yourself is, what are the scope of services that I want under a customer data platform? Then beyond that, there's a whole slew of potential CDP use cases. And so this is what's going to be really critical to you in terms of selecting what's the right solution. And certainly those of you who know Real Story Group know that this is the really key area where we pivot our research and our evaluations around, which is to what extent is a vendor suited for different use cases. In this case, we've isolated 9 use cases. And I can tell you that no single CDP vendor is very good at more than 2 or 3 of these. It's just the nature of the beast, and that's normal across any software. And so you really want to think carefully, what are our top priorities, and then what's our lower level priorities? So I'll just run through these really quickly, and then we'll get some examples, and then we'll talk about what's the right way to select here. So, advanced customer data management. This is for customers where enterprises that have unusually complex customer data needs. So in theory, any CDP should give you customer data management. That's just really table stakes. That's what they do. But advanced customer data management allows you to do things like have virtual data stores, multiple data stores, really sophisticated treatment of the data going in and out, advanced services for unusually messy environments. And so there are certain CDP vendors that really focus a lot more on this and a little bit less around activation. But then the other big use case, perhaps the biggest use case, is to support outbound marketing campaigns. So really kind of liberating your customer and prospect data from your email service provider or marketing automation platform, maintaining it at the lower level where you can build more sophisticated segments, and then pushing those segments out to whatever outbound you're doing, whether it's email, of course, predominantly, but also social, mobile messaging, what have you. We'll talk about that one a little bit more in a minute or so. Predictive analytics, interesting use case. Very often organizations may already have a data lake, in which case that's where you do your predictive, but for organizations that don't, this can be kind of a lighter environment that's very accessible to marketers with a lot of unified and extended customer data. And we've seen definitely, I think, some surprises at how much intelligence can be gleaned once you get all this information into a single place. Online personalization, experience optimization. This is for inbound, so it's similar to outbound, but it's more around driving personalization and experience on your website and applications. E-commerce recommendations and optimization is kind of a specialized subset of that, again, affecting application behavior. Omnichannel and offline aggregation. So this is really being able to stitch together more common experiences, including bringing in direct mail, call centers, mobile, all of that. Real-time behavioral analysis. This is pretty cutting-edge stuff. you have to think about this carefully because then your CDP becomes a runtime environment, but this is basically intercepting a session as it happens and interpreting the behavior and potentially making recommendations. B2B support, very interesting because historically CDPs came out of the business to consumer environment, but now we're actually seeing this to be a major growth area. It's been really fascinating among some of our subscribers that there's great interest even among some larger B2B. And then finally, last but certainly not least, which is support for digital advertising. So that was historically a use case for DMPs. Now with first-party data, a lot of interesting things happening around being able to unify that data to support your advertising campaign. So a lot of different use cases. And let's just dive into one of them. What any CDP should do is allow you to build segments, either manually or dynamic. You'll see a variety of different user interfaces for this. You're going to have to sort of test this out, but then the goal here is to actually activate those segments. And so ideally then you connect to an ESP or marketing automation platform to push that data forward to then do a custom message out to a particular set of customers. So you see there's a variety of different use cases, and at Real Story Group, we evaluate these vendors according to these use cases. So this is a look at IBM UBX, and UBX isn't quite a pro forma CDP, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but even so, if you go to IBM and you say you need a CDP, they're likely to put this in front of you. It's more of a data integration environment. So this is what it can do and can't do. It can help you a little bit with recommendations and predictive. Almost all of the intelligence here relates to being bound to Watson as well, so that becomes a key part of your investment as well. So you can see this is kind of a master of or jack of a few trades, master of none with respect to use cases. But again, this is looking at how a vendor may or may not cover different things. Then, of course, you always want to look at strategic considerations when you're looking at a vendor. And so at Real Story Group, we break this down into three categories. The vendor, first of all, which can be customer support, strategy, their professional services, their viability and stability system in the area, where IBM obviously is going to show some historic strengths. Then we look at some of the product strategic considerations, and here's obviously where there's some issues with this particular platform with respect to value for money and its roadmap as a CDP doesn't look particularly promising. And then finally, the really big one that we always tend to weight heavily when we're advising our subscribers in their product selection is ecosystem, particularly that middle one, community strength, really critical for the long-term success and viability of the platform. And what's interesting is that, if we look across these set of criteria for this marketplace, because some of the big vendors are distracted and some of the smaller pure play vendors are relatively new, although they've attracted a lot of venture funding. In terms of strategic considerations, in general, we would say this is a kind of global area of weakness in this whole marketplace. And I just want to show you a visual that sort of describes that. So when you're a Real Story Group subscriber, you can generate a custom quadrant. And the quadrant uses those two facets that we just talked about. On the x-axis is the scenario fit. So you identify the scenarios that are important to you, you weight them, and then to the farther right the vendor is, the better. Then strategic consideration is the same thing, but using those 10 aspects that we just looked at as far as vendor, product, and ecosystem intangible. So if we just do a kind of a generic run of this with the CDP market, what's interesting about the way this quadrant works out is it's kind of saggy. That is, the vendors are running kind of low, which means just generally speaking across a bucket of all these different vendors, the strategic considerations tend to be lower, which means that you tend to see somewhat weaker vendors, somewhat weaker product direction, and in particular, fairly weak ecosystems. And so this doesn't mean you shouldn't invest in customer data platforms. In fact, many of your peers already have or are looking into it right now. What it does mean is that you need to go in with your eyes wide open and obviously with really critical mitigation strategies. So I'll come back to this real quadrant a little bit later, but I wanted to just sort of review that with you. So here's some themes then as we're looking at this marketplaces. You have on the one hand the major suite vendors. They tend to be parochial, incomplete, and non-persistent, which means that they tend to be more around doing kind of dynamic integration among their existing tool sets as opposed to having a persistent universal data store that can connect to any experience environment, right? And so, to be honest, these four are somewhat struggling in this space, at least today. I think they have varying plans going forward. Now, the pure play platforms, a growing space. Nearly $1 billion in venture funds have gone into this over the last several years. So they are small, independent, very specialized in some cases, so that's good. Just as we mentioned before, maybe not as mature. But it's an expanding marketplace. Two notable absents here are Microsoft and Amazon. They seem to be content to provide the underlying infrastructure. In other words, many of these pure play vendors will actually run in Azure or AWS, take advantage of some of the data services underneath, but neither Microsoft nor Amazon, similar to that matter for IBM and Oracle, have not really put together productized pro forma CDPs, at least not yet. Okay, so how do you go about selecting a CDP? The Real Story Group, we're always going to tell you to apply design thinking. And in fact, my colleague Jared Gingras and I wrote a book about this very issue called The Right Way to Select Technology. You can find it on Amazon, published by Rosenfeld Media. And basically, we're suggesting you take the basic tenets of design thinking and have a more agile-ish approach to selecting. This works particularly well for a CDP, where you want to put a team together, then test and iterate those tests, and then adapt your process to make sure you're getting the right fit. So let's talk about that a little bit more. First, you want to build an interdisciplinary selection team. So CDPs are designed to be used by marketers. So the selection team should be led by a marketer or someone in your marketing operations side. Having said that, these are somewhat technically demanding environments. There's key issues here around performance and security. So you'll definitely want various members of your IT team involved. You may have to build some custom connectors, so maybe you want developers involved. You definitely want your data science people involved. And also, potentially your experienced managers and campaign managers, people who will actually be activating these segments and putting this data to use. So you really want an interdisciplinary selection team with ample technical expertise, but ideally led by a business person. Then you want to evaluate the use case fit and strategic considerations. So again, you can try out the tools that we have, specifically Real Quadrant Shortlist Generator, where you'll decide which of those 9 CDP use cases are really important for you, which of those 10 strategic considerations are really important for you, weight those out and generate a custom quadrant. So that's one way to get to a short list, and then you can, of course, read all of the detailed strengths and weaknesses that we have in our research, and ultimately come up with a short list to target. We're still big believers in RFPs. They have something of a bad rap in the industry, but that's usually because people tend to do these sort of generic checklist-based RFPs, or heaven forbid, they use an RFP from a vendor, which you never ever want to do. So you build your own RFP, but you use those narrative test cases, right? You develop narrative test cases that are focused on your use cases, have the vendor respond to those, ultimately come in and do demos. You don't do their generic demos, you have them demo your test cases. And then really, really, really critically, what you want to do then is have a bake-off. And here you bring 2 vendors in, you actually bring them into your environment. Many, if not most, CDP vendors will pride themselves on their ability to very quickly stand up an initial implementation. You've got to work through some of the issues of feeding them some data, but to really start playing out, hey, here's how this would work. Here's how I could activate a segment. Here's how I can bring in and unify all this different customer data. So we definitely recommend a bake-off. Always do it with 2 vendors, and then you find what life is going to actually be like using this platform and working with this vendor, rather than being in a situation where it's like you're buying a car and the salesperson's just driving the car around in the parking lot. No, you want to get behind the wheels and actually try it out yourself. So again, you definitely want to have a competitive bake-off, real scenarios, real data, real people, a real environment. It's not a production environment, so you're not actually activating this data, but you're simulating what life would be like. Also gives you a chance to negotiate effectively. So yes, this is resource intensive, but particularly with something I think this sensitive, this foundational, it's supposed to be at the foundational layer in your MarTech and engagement stack. You know, what's the cost of a failed selection or implementation? So if you're serious about this, then you'll definitely want to go forward with this. So leave you with some key takeaways, and then we'll get to your questions. Once again, invite you to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. So CDPs are definitely poised to be a key, foundational layer in your enterprise stack, especially for B2C enterprises, but increasingly for B2B as well. It is early days, however. That doesn't mean you should not move forward if your alternative is to build something highly custom, which is going to be expensive and brook a lot of delays. However, you do need to really go in with your eyes wide open. And of course, you want to have some forethought on your data models, the functional scope, what are your priorities. The CDP marketplace is highly fragmented and getting more so every day. So you really want to focus on your specific use cases and then take steps to mitigate it against potential vendor or ecosystem immaturity. Definitely try before you buy as part of a broader agile-oriented sort of design thinking fueled selection process featuring really hands-on adaptive testing. At Real Story Group, we evaluate now 24 CDP platforms using the same methodology that I've described here. Our research, again, known for being very hard-hitting and identifying the real weaknesses and strengths of these tools. I encourage you to download a sample if you haven't already. And with that, here's some other contact information and sampling of some of the other services that and other marketplaces that we evaluate. And Scott, if you want to just talk about next steps, and I'm going to sort through some of the questions that are coming in.
Thanks, Tony. That sounds great. Looks like there are a couple of questions, so we'll get to those momentarily. But I do want to remind you that we offer these webinars typically a couple of times a month, and the next presentation that we'll have is on February 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern about how to select technology in a hurry. So if you haven't signed up for that one anymore, we encourage you to do so. Also, as Tony mentioned, you're welcome to download excerpts from the CDP research as well as any other markets we cover to get an idea of our writing style and the pull no punches approach we take in detailing the strengths and weaknesses of the vendors. And certainly if you're interested in learning more about the subscription offerings that we have and would like to see a demonstration of what will be available to you as a subscriber, please feel free to reach out to us and we can get that on the calendar ASAP. With that, Tony, looks like there are a couple questions that have come in.
Yeah, so the first one's from David. He's asking, what's the difference between a DMP like Adobe Audience Manager and a specialized CDP vendor like Tealium when it comes to personalization? I could say a specialized CDP vendor like Tealium and 24 others. So a DMP focuses on third-party customer data, so everything is anonymized. There's no PII. You're sharing that data with other customers of the DMP platform as well, which brings its benefits and obvious drawbacks as well. DMPs historically were designed to enable you to do targeted advertising and more effective advertising. It originally kind of came out of a direct mail environment, and they play a strong niche there. What they miss is all of the first-party data that you have, which is quite rich, and that unified customer record with everything that you know about them, which is an asset that you as the enterprise really want to own and obviously keep secure and private. And so that's what a CDP vendor does. And then that allows you to do much richer forms of personalization, whether with respect to outbound communications or even inbound personalization. So the other question is from Roberta, and she's asking, looks like her colleagues are recommending building a custom data platform using in AWS. Well, you can certainly do that, and AWS gives you a lot of services around that, but the key word you put there is custom, right? AWS is not going to give you a packaged CDP environment with some of the capabilities like you saw with respect to using drag and drop to create customer segments and things like that. You'll be essentially building your own. They'll provide some core data services, which is useful. What we see more frequently is organizations using Amazon services for like a bigger data lake, where you're just throwing a bunch of things in and then doing some modeling and some interesting simulations and predictive work against that, as opposed to a more marketing and activation focused CDP, which tends to be something much more packaged. And we think it's now really apt for using commercialized, productized vendor solutions for that rather than a generic data management environment. So Brent is asking, has RealStory done any price comparisons beyond the general concept of value for the money? Yes, with the caveat that pricing can be a little bit loopy and you have to really nail things down in an RFP. But we have, where there was good data available, we share what the rough costs are likely to be. Again, with the caveat that while nominally many of these vendors will charge you based on the size of your data set, there can be a number of different considerations, including obviously things like number of marketing users, different modules that they're deploying, optional services, and that sort of thing. But where we have confidence in pricing, particularly after talking to customers, we definitely do share that in our research, Brent. All right, folks. Well, we've reached the bottom of the half hour here, so it was a real pleasure being with you again today. Feel free to reach out to me or to any of us at info@realstorygroup.com if you have any further questions, and look forward to staying engaged going forward. For Scott Gill, this is Tony Byrne from Real Story Group saying bye for now.